Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the York Festival of Ideas and to this event on grief and creativity. My name's Louise Richardson. I'm from the philosophy department at the University of York, and I'll be chairing today's event. And it's with great pleasure that I welcome you all here today. And in particular, I look forward to introducing our speakers. So at this event, myself and my fellow panelists will be talking about the role that creative pursuits can play during grief. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy, and my research expertise is in philosophy of mind and philosophy of psychology. I write on perception and the senses, and more recently, emotion, and I'll be telling you a bit more about my work on grief shortly. And joining me are Ritchie and Laura McDonagh. Excellent. From Projecting Grief, which you can see exhibited next door. If you haven't already been in, do take a look at Jo and Laura's exhibition. It's really very lovely. Their exhibition usually takes the form of an online gallery, and I think the in-person pop-up version is about two-thirds of what they have in the online gallery. And it explores the relationship between loss, creativity, and healing. And also joining us is textile artist Hayley Mills-Styles, who, for those of you who've booked tickets, will be running a session making some hand embroidery later. I believe a memory loop you're going to be making in honor of a special person or place. So that's our schedule of events on grief and creativity for the day. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to welcome Jo and Laura to talk to us about their project, Projecting Grief.
Hi everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today to tell you a little bit about our project. So my name's Laura. I am the interviewer and writer for Projecting Grief. This is Jo. She's the photographer who started the project back in 2019. And when people say, like, what is Projecting Grief? This is kind of like the sound bite that we use to explain it. So it's a portraiture and storytelling project exploring creativity for healing. And through it, we're asking lots of questions. So we're asking, can grief be a catalyst for creativity? Can something positive come out of a negative experience? And in all of that, we're not trying to sugarcoat loss, we're not trying to dismiss loss, but we are trying to put the focus on how creativity can be really helpful. So through the project, we tell people's stories. And there's a few, in fact, I don't know if we can get this little video. This is just a scrolling kind of, just to give you an idea, if you haven't popped in next door already, some of the images that are part of the project. So all of these people here and more, they are doing something creative after being bereaved, and they're doing it for various reasons. Sometimes they're doing it to find comfort, sometimes they're doing it to distract themselves, sometimes they're doing something really explicit that's some kind of tribute or testimony to the person that they've lost. But the common thread, I suppose, that unites all of them is that they are doing this creative thing out of their grief. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. We'll talk about how the project started now.
So I started the project after my brother died in 2017. He died by a gambling-related suicide. My parents went on to set up a charity. But I didn't feel like I really wanted to get involved in a campaign. So my way of kind of dealing with it was that I ended up starting this project. I'd been a photographer for kind of nearly 10 years before he died, and I really couldn't see myself getting back into a kind of a creative headspace. A lot of my work was portraiture, so kind of, when you're photographing people, it's about making them feel comfortable. And I didn't feel like I had that kind of, ease of conversation anymore in the same way. And so to kind of start a creative process again, I guess, was after I'd spoken to a couple of different people who I found were doing something creative that they found beneficial, that they found was helping them with their grieving process. I ended up kind of taking a few portraits and started thinking there was a bit of a project in this. And, that ended up being my kind of start of being creative again. And as part of that, I thought it needed context, it needed kind of interviews, it needed a writer on board. So I ended up teaming up with a writer in about 2019 who would interview them, and then all the kind of the pieces started online. They kind of took shape on a website. When she needed to take a step back in kind of, I think it was 2020, she took a step back from the project. I spoke to Laura because we'd featured her already on the project. And Laura kind of leapt at the chance to come and be involved.
True.
She kind of, when we'd met Laura, she was a writer already, and she just really got the project. She really got what we were trying to do, and kind of the sort of people that we were looking to tell the stories of. And so, she kind of came on board. So, you can tell your own bereavement story.
Yeah, so my background to getting involved, my mum died very suddenly in 2019. And then, of course, 3 months after that, we went into lockdown. And my background is a bit different to Joe's. I was, once upon a time, a secondary school English teacher. I had moved into freelance copywriting before my mum had died. But then something just happened in the pandemic. And I've spoken to a few people for the project who kind of echo this story, or they say something similar, that there was something about that period of like enforced lockdown where something a bit more creative was unleashed. I'd been sort of saying for ages, I'd like to write. I'd like to do a bit more writing for myself. And I wasn't actually doing it. And then I think, when somebody dies suddenly, I suppose it gives you a completely different perspective. The things that you've been kind of putting off for another day, that other day might not come. You might not ever get there. So, your only time is the present. So I started to write, and it was like something had been like unlocked in me. And then I heard about the project online. I think, Joe was kind of in the early stages of putting the website together and putting some stories together. And I saw it and thought, oh my goodness, this is the thing that I am doing, kind of without even realizing it. This is something that I completely get. So I was interviewed for the project, and Joe came and took my photograph. And then when the previous writer stepped back, I was really keen to get involved. I think it's a really moving project. I think, it tells stories, if I can say this, in a really beautiful way, a really sensitive way. So that's my story about how I got involved.
So we thought we'd just tell you a little bit about the first sitter. So Millie is how I kind of really started the project. I'd known Millie at school. We were in different years at school, but our brothers were both in the same year. And so after Jack died, Ethan, her brother, was, he'd come round, and me and my dad had spoken to him and lots of Jack's friends at the time, and Ethan was one of them. And then Ethan sadly died in 2019. And Millie was someone who I then kind of instantly connected with again. And she's from a very creative family anyway. We'd kind of always bumped into them at different festivals. They'd all be in kind of amazing get-up. And she'd lost her dad a few years previously, and she said that she'd found crochet really useful, that TV wasn't enough of a distraction, and that she needed to be doing something. And actually, crochet was kind of counting, was kind of giving her something else to think about, basically, and kind of not have to concentrate on what she was going through. So I think after Ethan died, she made all these amazing headdresses that everybody could wear at his funeral. So the people who were, the coffin bearers were all wearing one of these, and she'd left them on the chairs for other people to sort of join, and it was supposed to be a big celebration of Ethan. And then after the funeral, she got asked so many times of whether she was going to sell them, so she ended up selling them at festivals. And there's a really nice quote as part of her piece where she says about seeing these headdresses that she'd sold to strangers out in a field, and it was a little part, it's a tribute to Ethan, and a little part of Ethan still living on and kind of dancing in a field still. So, it was a really nice kind of touching part of that. So Millie was how I started the project, really. So I think we're just going to talk a bit about, which one is it, that one? Who we feature.
We also just wanted to say a little bit about the kind of people that we feature on the project. The answer to that is we feature all kinds of people. It's really important to us that the project is as broad and as diverse as possible. And I mean that in the sense of It's representative in terms of different types of losses. You know, we're very mindful that, you know, the loss of a parent will feel very different to the loss of a sibling, the loss of a partner, a friend. So we try and make sure that we cover as broad a range of losses as possible. We've also got quite a broad definition of creativity because, you know, again, that's a question that people often ask us, like, what is creativity? You know, it's almost impossible to define, really. So we sometimes have to have conversations between ourselves. If somebody comes forward and says, you know, oh, I'm doing this, you know, would that count? And it's like, you know, is that a creative practice? Is that not a creative practice? So
often sports or something in nature that we find really hard.
Neither of us are particularly sporty, so we're like, oh, is that a creative thing or not? But I mean, so there's now 50 stories on the online gallery. And on there we have got theatre makers, we've got poets, we've got painters, we've got a puppeteer, a puppet maker and a puppeteer. There's a man who makes rocking horses. So there's like a really, really broad range of different types of creativity. What we find at the moment is we're in a position where I would say probably 50% of people approach us and say, oh, we've seen the project online, be interested in being featured, and they've got a story. And often I think we find those people are professional artists, so that some of them are, you know, reasonably well known in the art world, or they're quite well known in the grief community, and they're really comfortable talking about their work. Sometimes we speak to people who are established artists, but after being bereaved, their work has taken like a completely different direction. So they've gone off and they've created something new, or they've even gone into like a new creative practice, a new art form. The other type of stories that we feature are probably the hardest ones to find, and they're people who are working their 9-to-5 job, but they are doing something creative in their own time. And sometimes we often have people, or we sometimes have people who come to us and say, oh, I'm not creative, you know, that's not me. And actually, maybe through seeing the project, maybe through reading one of the stories, the penny drops that they are actually doing something creative. It has been a response to their grief, and they're doing it because it's helpful in some way. And it's lovely, actually, when that happens, because those stories, like I say, they are the hardest to find, but they're really satisfying stories to showcase and to tell. So that's really important to us. The project, as time has gone on, we've kind of realized that it's based on two, like, fairly central principles. And those principles are creativity is really powerful. You know, we believe that absolutely. And the second one being that creativity is for everyone. You know, it's not this like elitist activity. It's, you know, that's where the kind of diversity angle is really important to us. It's really important to show people that it's a really broad spectrum, and it's not just for certain types of people. So, yeah, I think that was everything we were going to say about that. You'll see a few examples of, so when you go next door and have a little look at the exhibition, you'll see a portrait of, I think there's 34 pictures in there, but there's also a little intro to that person and a QR code at the bottom. And if you click on the QR code, you'll see more portraits of that person, usually engaged doing their creative thing, whatever it might be. And there's like a 700 or so word story there as well. So, you know, please do feel free, or you can look at your leisure at a later date. But there's some examples just up there of people doing their creative thing. And one of the people that we have spoken to is Hayley, who's over here. She is an embroidery and textile artist. She's absolutely incredible at what she does. She will be running a hands-on workshop this afternoon, which is completely suitable for beginners, because again, creativity is for everyone, and it's really important to stress that for those people who have booked on. And yeah, so Hayley is going to come up and tell us a little bit about her work now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. So, as people have mentioned, I'm a textile artist. That basically means I have the greatest job, because I get to embroider things and teach other people how to embroider. And Joe and I met in a cafe in Leeds, what seems like a long time ago, in 2019. It wasn't my first sort of work dealing with and thinking about grief. So my story sort of always sounds really sad. So when I was 2 years old, my mum couldn't look after me, and I went to live with my dad's parents. And they were the greatest people. They're responsible for the creativity in my life. But because they were in their 50s, I always knew that they wouldn't be here as long as other people's parents. But what they gave me was this wonderful thing of doing things with your hands. My granddad was an engineer and a woodworker. He could build you anything. If you said you needed something, he would disappear into his workshop, and 2 hours later, he would come out with the thing that you asked for. My grandma was a knitter and a baker, not an embroiderer. When I was 4 years old and I couldn't knit, 4 years old, she gave me the Anchor 100 Stitches embroidery book and said, maybe you can do that instead. So she had many great qualities. Patience was not one of them, but she was right. Embroidery was something that came naturally to me. And I started making work about my family. My granddad died when I was 17 in 1997. And yeah, that was my first sort of real thing of loss on a sort of, really close family level. And I was the one helping my grandma do everything, and we were sort of, we sort of became stronger, sort of living together and being together and supporting ourselves through that. But around sort of 2013, my grandma started to get quite unwell. She'd already, I told her other older people collect things like spoons. She collected the trans-ischemic attacks, and I told her you could collect spoons instead. But she became sort of quite unwell quite quickly. And what I found really sort of disturbing about that, I realised, although I had half siblings and biological parents out in the world, nobody else knew my story and my family life, because for the longest time it was me and my grandparents, and that was our little family unit. And as my grandma was starting to suffer the effects of dementia, I wanted to start recording the work. And during my masters, I started this work called Deconstruct, Reconstruct. And it all started when I went into a charity shop in Leeds and found a sofa from the 1930s. If anyone knows anything about upholstery, it was a shell-backed sofa, incredibly itchy fabric, filled with what they called horsehair, which is actually just coconut fibre, not real horsehair. And it just started to bring up all these memories about my childhood home, which had been sold. My grandma was living in sheltered accommodation, so I didn't have a childhood home anymore. I had a few possessions that my dad and my uncle had deemed worthless, so I basically had a huge bag of textiles and a lot of Tupperware. So those are the things that I took with me. Like even my grandma's sewing box, all her knitting stuff had gone. I literally was left with a bag of domestic textiles and this, wonderful collection of Tupperware. But I started sort of making these pieces, and the middle picture at the top is all photographs of my grandma. There was a big box of family photographs, and I started stitching and started making all these things and making up. I'm not a wonderful writer like Laura, but I started making up these little bits of stories about my childhood. Because, nobody was there to remember it. I would ask my grandma, and she would remember her childhood, but not mine. And then, sadly, my grandma actually died in 2015, not long after her 90th birthday. And making just became even more important. It just became that thing that connected me to my grandparents, how they'd sort of passed on their skills, and thinking about sort of being in the kitchen baking. That's another thing when we talk about people not being creative. Baking, cooking, anything like that is a creative skill. And I would think about all those times, and I would think about her telling me off for not knitting properly. And then when I got more into sewing, telling me off, apparently you shouldn't take apart your clothes to see how they're made. But YouTube didn't exist, so we had to do that. We just had to take things apart. But it's become this integral part of what I do. I've made a lot of work about my grandparents, a lot of work that showcases things. In the bag of textiles, for example, I had the collar from my granddad's shirt when shirts still had a loose collar. So I've done things like replicate that to make a commemorative wreath for him. All these wonderful things that I find it connects me with them because they taught me everything that they started me off on that foundation. Creativity was never a silly word in our house. I was always brought up to be told that I could be anything I wanted to be, and from a very young age, I did want to be an artist, and they never told me no, even though loads of people think it's a silly job. So yeah, I just had that real support and encouragement from them, which, and making has also really helped me. Embarrassingly, I was on the One Show several years ago, standing next to Jasmine Harmon, which is enough to make anyone feel like a very frumpy, unappealing human to look at. I also make a lot of work about mental health. A lot of my, all of my life I've struggled with my mental health. And it also helps me in terms of that. It gives me something to do. I'm very lucky to have a home studio. And even on a terrible day, I can go into that studio, I can pick up some thread, I can pick up some fabric, and I can connect with it and connect with my grandparents. I keep some of my embroidery supplies in the lovely Tupperware with my grandma's little labels on it. I've got, pieces of, I've got tools and equipment that belonged to my grandparents that now my husband is using as well. He's taken up woodwork, which was something my granddad was really passionate about. And their sort of influence affects every day of my life and how I sort of go about doing things. And unfortunately, I have to read this from my phone, but I want to finish with a lovely quote from Louise Bourgeois, who some of you may know her work, made lots of beautiful things. And she just said, "I always had the fear of being separated and abandoned. The sewing is my attempt to keep things together, to make things whole." And I just thought that was a wonderful sort of way to describe what I do, that keeping things together, keeping those, family traditions of making and creativity together, and sharing them with other people through what I do in workshops. And I will never make you do another craft when you can't do the craft I'm teaching you. So yeah, they're always with me in everything I do, and being part of this project is just really sort of, people ask if it makes me feel sad, and I said, no, it makes me happy, because we're all connected by grief. We've all lost somebody important to us, and it really sort of gives me that feeling of you're not alone when it comes to that. We have our creativity and we have other people to connect with, which is hugely important for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and comments from everybody else. So from the beginning of 2020 to the end of 2023, I was part of a project in the philosophy department funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council called Grief, a Study of Human Emotional Experience. And the overall aim of that project was to develop a detailed, wide-ranging and integrated account of the experience of grief, of what it's like to grieve. And one way in which we worked towards that aim was via an online survey. So we had 21 open-ended questions, and in the end we received 265 often really detailed responses to those questions from people who were grieving or had experienced grief during their life. We've since made those responses available in anonymized form on our website, if you want to have a look. There's also a handout that you'll be getting on your way out with details of how to access that on our website more generally. So we've seen from Hayley and from Joe and Laura that creative activities can help those who are grieving, right? That's manifestly the case. And I want to end by saying something about the experience of grief, drawing on the work of this project, which in turn might help us to see why creativity can be so helpful for those who are undergoing this experience. And also what else might help. So we might usefully begin, I think, by thinking about what grief isn't. And what grief isn't is just feeling sad as a result of experiencing a bereavement. Right? It's a great deal more than that. And neither is grief feeling lots of different emotions in a predictable sequence. Right? That's a very popular picture of grief, that it's a sequence of a small number of emotions. That isn't right. People experience very diverse, varied emotions during grief. And they also have many experiences which aren't emotions. So many people during grief have experiences that they describe as feeling the presence of the person who's died. And lots of grieving people feel that their experience of time has changed in some way, that it's sped up, that it's slowed down, sometimes that it's stopped altogether. Another common experience in grief that people often find quite difficult to put into words is a sense that somehow everything has changed. So consider, for example, C.S. Lewis's description of how it felt for him after his wife had died. So he said, "The act of living is different all through. Her absence was like the sky, spread over everything." Or one of our survey participants tried to explain how it felt to them like this: "I feel like everything about the world that I've known is completely foreign now. The world seems like a different place." Another respondent said to them it felt like the world wasn't really there. And for another, "I felt like a ghost." Others talked to feeling as if they were in a bubble or behind glass or looking through gauze. So this sense that everything is different in some way that's kind of hard to describe without drawing on metaphors is very common to the experience of grief. And we can start to understand why grief is so all-encompassing and why it can make it feel like everything's changed by recognizing that a significant bereavement causes disruption to what we might call your assumptive world or your construction of reality. So this is a preponderance of assumptions and habits and expectations and a great deal else besides that form the typically unrecognized backdrop to your experiences and actions. So someone who really matters to you can be woven into that assumptive world in ways that, so long as they're alive, you never really notice or think about. So you may have plans and projects and pastimes that depend on them. You may have assumptions about how things will go on in the short term and the long term that involve them, and expectations that can't be met without them. You might even have values, things that really matter to you that are only sustainable given their continued living presence. And all this background gets disrupted when they die. So this can help us to see why grief is so much more than sadness, or even profound sadness, and why it involves these changes to how everything seems that we saw described just now. So the world seems like a different place to the grieving person because it really is, right? The world out there is no longer the world that fits the assumptive world that they've carried around with them. And grief doesn't just involve experiencing these changes to the assumptive world. It also encompasses what philosopher Thomas Attig has called relearning the world, which is adjusting all those plans and projects and pastimes and assumptions and expectations and values to catch up to what's happened. And furthermore, this is something that can't happen in a short period of time, right? We all know how difficult it is to change just one habit. So how much longer then does it take to adjust a whole assumptive world to a devastating loss? So, for those who find that creativity helps in their grief, it might not just be a matter of finding distraction from feelings of sadness or other emotions, right? It might be that, but it can be a lot else besides. It can also provide help in managing this experience of a disrupted, assumptive world, and also help with this process of rebuilding or relearning a world in light of significant loss. And this help could take many forms, which I think if you look at the exhibition later, you'll find these patterns in what people say about how their creative pastime or projects helped them. So, for example, those who already have a creative pastime, picking this up again in grief can be a way of carrying a bit of that old world into the new, relearned world. It can provide some continuity. Undertaking a brand new creative project or pastime can amount to finding a brand new thread to weave into this new world that you're tasked with building. And creative activities might also help with making sense of one's loss. So as we said, the assumptive world or construction of reality that gets disrupted in grief is something that usually is in the background, unattended to, not noticed. And that's why once it's disrupted, as it is by bereavement, it can be very hard to describe what's happening to you, right? This isn't something that we have words to describe. So some creative endeavors can help with that, allowing people to put into words or some other form that which might otherwise remain elusive. And in addition, and we heard this in Hayley's description of her work, creative activities can be a way of taking the person who's died with you into this new world that you're relearning. So there's a model of grief called the continuing bonds model of grief, according to which, although the bereaved person is tasked with relearning the world, they do this in a way that involves maintaining their relationship with the person who's died. You don't leave the person who's died in the disrupted, assumptive world. And you can undertake a creative activity in a way that serves just that purpose. Right? For instance, you can create something that helps you to remember the person, or you can take up some activity that they enjoyed, or some activity that you know that they would have approved of. It can be a way of maintaining this relationship with the person who's gone. So let me end with just 2 more remarks on our theme before opening the discussion up to everyone. So the first is that once we start thinking about the nature of grief as we have done here, we can see that it might be an experience that's not restricted to bereavement, right? And in fact, this was something we came across again and again in our project work, that people had experiences that they readily described as grief in response to other losses, and often losses that are quite hard to identify. So we had a small number of people respond to our survey talking about their sense of grief over their childlessness, for example. And that wasn't the loss of a particular child, it was the loss of the capacity to have children. But similar disruptions to this disruption to the assumptive world caused by bereavement can be associated with many significant losses, such as losing a job, losing a home, the kinds of losses that are associated with serious illness, whether that's your own or somebody you love, or environmental destruction. So the role for creative endeavors in managing loss might be quite extensive. If we experience a lot of loss, and if creativity helps with loss, then there's a lot that creativity can help with. Secondly, and finally, thinking a bit about the role that creative activities have for some who are grieving also suggests some other things that might be of help for similar reasons. That is, other things that can help us to relearn the world. And in our grief survey, we asked participants what, if anything, they had found helped them in their grief. Now, as we saw with all of the questions we asked, the answers were very, very varied, right? There's no one size fits all for anything to do with grief. Nevertheless, it's good to end on a hopeful note, and also by expressing our gratitude to those survey respondents who contributed so much to our project. So, the last thing I want to show you then is a list of 10 things that one respondent said that were helpful to them. And there's a lovely mix on this list of creative and other kinds of activity. So, poetry, making stuff, walking and being outside in the countryside, playing the piano, getting a good night's sleep, doing useful stuff and kind deeds, being with my children, massages, keeping busy, and finally, reading lots of books about grief and about other people's experiences, which of course is something that you can do in the exhibition and by taking a look at our survey data. So, thank you very much for your attention. We now have about 25 minutes for questions or comments from you, so please do raise your hand up high if you would like to ask something of us.